November the 19th, 1917, near the French city of Cambrai. In total secrecy, the British Army has assembled an armada of 378 tanks. Cambrai will be the first large-scale tank battle in history.
The question ever uppermost in all our minds is, do the Germans suspect anything? We know they captured 3 of our chaps in a raid 2 nights previous. Have they given the show away?
Lieutenant Basil Henriques commands a squadron of tanks. His mission will be to lead the tanks on foot into the battle. The next morning, his squadron and the other British tanks are to cut through the German front line to strike the decisive blow that will end the World War.
The battle was to start at 6:20, and as there was nothing for me to do until then, I had the best 3 hours sleep. I wake at 5:15. The Germans are shelling us. It can mean only one thing. They know we are coming.
The Germans have been warned at the last minute. They open fire with every gun and cannon they have at the approaching tanks.
I tell myself, God, make thy presence felt to me, and make me strong and brave. The tanks follow me, and off we go into the heart of the storm.
On one side are iron monsters, England's tanks. On the other side are Germany's mighty guns. Which will prevail here on the plains of Cambrai, here in the heart of this battle? Armour or weapon?
The tank is an idea that's been around for centuries because when you think about it, everybody, every soldier has wanted to be mobile, to be protected, and to have some form of weapon, some firepower.
For centuries, the race between weapon and armour was dominated by cannons. Engineers around the world strove to make them ever bigger and more deadly. In 1903, a young Austrian engineer joined his country's army to do just that. But then came the day he saw what modern cannons could do.
Today I witnessed the power of our newest weapons for the first time. It took my breath away. What scares me is that every other country has weapons just as powerful. And our soldiers have no way of protecting themselves. If a war breaks out, it will bring atrocious bloody losses.
Instead of building bigger guns, Gunther Borstein begins looking for something that can shield his fellow soldiers in battle. His research leads him to his country's navy. Its warships are clad in thick steel armour.
March 15th, 1903. I'm standing on deck and watching the torpedo boats crisscross the waves like dolphins. I'm deeply fascinated by these warships. In the midst of this high-spirited journey, I, a landlubber, suddenly thought, if only we could approach an enemy on land this well protected.
Borstein's idea? To build an armoured landship, a kind of torpedo boat that can drive on firm ground. But how to power such a vehicle? The torpedo boats on the ocean are propelled by giant steam engines, which are too bulky to use on land. Instead, Borstein turns to a much smaller alternative, the internal combustion engine. Cars based on this engine have been around for just over a decade and are not yet widespread. To learn more about this engine, Borstein visits the Vienna Auto Show in 1905.
I am overwhelmed by what I see. There it stands, at the booth of Daimler, an armoured car. That's my land torpedo boat, I call. But then, I see a problem. Like any other car, it drives on 4 slim wheels.
Just like other automobiles, these new armoured cars have to stay on paved roads or risk getting stuck in rough terrain. Borstein decides he needs an alternative to the wheel.
I envision a chain of metal plates connected by joints, which I would loop around the wheels. This spreads out the weight of the vehicle, especially if I use more than just 2 wheels per side. I name my design Motorgeschütz. As its main weapon, I choose a rotating turret, such as I have seen on warships. With this, my Motorgeschütz can drive in one direction and fire in another. I will armor it in thick steel plates. And for it to be able to go over craters and trenches, I design extendable arms in the front and back.
Günther Borstein spends 8 years perfecting his design. He submits it to the Austrian War Ministry in 1911.
My design was rejected. Nobody listens, no matter how much I warn them of the dangers of a new war. I decide to take my invention to Germany. Here, I am sure, people are more modern in their thinking and will appreciate my Motorgeschütz.
Actually, similar ideas are going on in a number of different countries. The problem with a lot of these early experiments is at a time when the military don't actually see a need for this type of weapon.
Auch in Berlin.
I have been turned down in Berlin as well. I don't have the means to build the Motorgeschütz myself. Thus, I have to shelve my plans and bury them in the lowest drawer of my desk.
The war that Günther Borstein foresaw begins on July the 28th, 1914. He too is called up.
In 1914, everyone had seen that war coming, perhaps thinking it was going to be as 100 years before at Waterloo. Armies manoeuvring to meet in the field, a field of battle. They were looking at it much more as we might have seen a Wellington-Napoleon battle than what then develops.
Four million soldiers stream onto the battlefields of Europe in 1914. But as Borstein predicted, there is nothing to shield them from the shrapnel of the artillery or the bullets from the machine guns.
Our men die without even getting close to the enemy. And then I think again of my Motorgeschütz. If only we had a flotilla of these. But it would take a year and a half to build them. By that time, my commanders say, we'll long be home victorious.
By Christmas of 1914, within just 5 months, 1 million soldiers have died. The survivors begin digging trenches at the edges of the battlefields. Here they are safe from enemy fire, but can also continue to shoot. Within just a few weeks, a system of trenches springs up that stretches from the North Sea to the Swiss border.
By digging in as well, it gives you protection from artillery fire, from rifle fire. They set up barbed wire, and early in the war, this is relatively simple as a blocking measure for infantry or horse cavalry attacking. But then as the war progresses, that wire becomes thicker and thicker into enormous belts. And that's why in the West we have to think of new ideas, the Allied armies coming up with new ways. How can we actually defeat this new type of defensive mechanisms?
By early 1915, the war has become a bloody stalemate. To overcome it, both sides turn to new weapons. The German army is the first to use poison gas. British engineers drive tunnels underneath the German trenches and fill them with explosives. And a French officer revives Günther Borstein's idea of the armoured fighting vehicle, of the tank. Jean-Baptiste, called Eugène Estienne, leads France's best artillery unit. Their cannons are very effective, but only at close range.
During our recent attacks, one thing suddenly became abundantly clear to me. Victory in this war will belong to whichever country first succeeds to build a cannon onto a vehicle capable of crossing any terrain.
Estienne's plan: to get his cannons close enough to be able to fire into the enemy's trenches. But his cannons are heavy and already prone to getting stuck. Estienne wants to surround them with armour, tracks, and an engine strong enough to power them. But like Borstein before, he too is turned down.
Our generals don't think it can be done. They think the gun is too big, and that no engine will be able to drive it. I've given up trying to achieve anything through the army. But today, I found out that the Schneider Arms Company has begun developing a tank on its own.
The Schneider tank was actually influenced initially by one of the workers, one of the engineers at Schneider, was contacted by a soldier friend of his who explains what had happened in some of the early battles, had seen that Schneiders were building some early tracked vehicles to help tow artillery, and that pushes forward the idea of building a tank.
At last, my transfer to Schneider was approved. I will liaise with them in building this new vehicle. And we're making great progress. The CA-1, as our tank is called, must be fast and agile. But I had to give up the idea of a big cannon. It would simply be too heavy. A much smaller gun will have to do.
Estienne changes the objective of the tank. It is to cut through the massive barbed wire obstacles. He takes the design to his superiors, and the French army orders 400 to be built. The United Kingdom is France's closest ally in the war against Germany. Many of its soldiers are volunteers. One of them is Basil Henricus. Before the war, he led a boys' club for deprived Jewish children.
I want to follow my brother, who was one of the first to be killed in this wretched war. But like thousands of others who find themselves in uniform, I realize that I'm not cut out to be a soldier. I hate it. One never knows what one is doing, nor why. Today, my commanding officer told me that he had selected me to be transferred to a different unit. It seems that my military career is over before it has even begun.
Henricus's orders do not say what kind of unit he is transferred to, only that it is called the Heavy Machine Gun Corps.
I meet the colonel, who commands the corps. He is very secretive about its nature. "What do you know about motor cars?" he asks. "Nothing at all, sir," I reply. The colonel looks me up and down and nods. "If you are no use, you will be sent back at the end of a fortnight."
Since early 1915, British engineers have secretly been working on a tracked vehicle to break through the German trenches. But unlike the French design, its objective is not to cut through, but plough down the barbed wire. Like Borstein's Motorgeschütz, the British design is inspired by the Navy. Its name? Landship Little Willie.
When you see Little Willie, it looks exactly like a water tank, a water carrier. So the word tank was actually picked up on as a code word because they realised the idea of calling the vehicle something like a land ship. It says what it is. It's a ship on the land, so it gives the game away too much. Tank, less so it sticks.
To make Little Willie into a better weapon, it is elongated and armed with cannons. The new model is called Mother. On May the 15th, 1916, Henricus and the men of the Heavy Machine Gun Corps are awakened by engine noises outside their quarters. Mother has come, and they are to train with her.
No firstborn child has ever been welcomed with quite so much excitement as we welcomed Mother. And no mother has ever enjoyed playing with her child as we all did with her. The training seems to be one huge game. We look for trees to knock down and picture ourselves slowly wending our way to Berlin.
While working with tanks, Henricus finds a military duty he enjoys and is good at. He is promoted to tank commander.
I have 8 men in my crew. There's myself, the driver, 4 men to work the guns, and 2 to shift gears.
The tank is to drive onto the German trenches and fire down into them. And to find out which guns work best, the army tests 2 different tank designs.
Mine is a female tank, which means it has 2 machine guns per side. Male tanks have 1 large cannon instead. Our tank can make 8 kilometers per hour, just faster than a soldier walking beside it. When the engine is full out, the smell, heat, and above all the noise is almost unbearable.
Inside the tank, the soldiers are cut off from the rest of the world. To still be able to send messages, the tanks are equipped with one of the Army's most reliable means of communication.
Today we were in the middle of an exercise when we were handed a cage full of carrier pigeons, together with paper and pens.
If you want to communicate back to your own lines, they took carrier pigeons inside the vehicles in a little basket, and the idea was you wrote your message, tied it to the leg of the pigeon, let that go out the rear of the vehicle, and hopefully that flew back to your lines and the message was passed on.
In June of 1916, France's tank commander Estienne visits the Heavy Machine Gun Corps. He wants to see Britain's tanks and find a way for England and France to cooperate in building them.
Voici donc les tanks. So these are the tanks, as the British call them. 5 enormous archaic monsters crawling across the fields. They are impressive indeed, but so huge and slow that it worries me. I fear that the German artillery will have an easy time picking them off.
Estienne pushes for England and France to combine their efforts to decide on one tank model and build it jointly. But the arms factories in both countries are already building hundreds of tanks. Cancelling these contracts would mean stiff fees.
Building tanks in the First World War is a problem for a number of reasons, one of which is by the time they come up with designs for the tanks, the war effort has been going for a while. So lots of the factories that could build these sorts of vehicles already got war work in other areas, such as building tractors or steam engines or whatever's required.
There will be no joint tank program. The British preferred to send their few tanks into battle alone. What a mistake. And furthermore, what kind of a name is tank? It sounds like a latrine. Next time somebody gives me grief about them, I will say, "Ah, yes, I understand. You mean septic tanks."
Estienne returns to France, his mission a failure. But once back, he receives the first Schneider CA-1 tanks. Now he can begin training the men he will need for his tanks.
Our tank troops must be an elite unit. You can tell a real tanker instantly. Very sportive, a confident walk, their hair is cropped short, their beards trimmed, and they have a wild passion for the army.
But then Estienne finds out that the French army has commissioned a second tank model.
Today I saw this Saint-Chamond for the first time. 6 millimeters of armor? I tested it with my service pistol. The bullet went straight through. The papers on my desk would offer more protection. And that's not even the worst part.
The Saint-Chamond builds on Estienne's former plan to have a mobile version of the French 75mm cannon. But as Estienne himself realized, such a large gun requires too much space in the front of the tank. Consequently, the Saint-Chamond hangs 2.5 meters over its tracks in the front. This makes it unable to cross trenches. But despite this, the French army orders 400 to be built, in addition to 400 Schneiders already in production. By August 1916, England's Heavy Machine Gun Corps has received its first 50 tanks. Basil Henricus and the other crews receive their transfer orders for the front.
I told my men that our tank was going to go through at all cost. We felt a terrific pride as a tank crew against other tank crews. This healthy competition carried us right out to France.
The tanks are brought to the front in utmost secrecy. Their first appearance is planned as a nasty surprise for the Germans.
We are terrifically excited. We have not got the least pangs of fear. We spend the day tuning the engines before starting off to our positions behind the front line. Thousands of troops rush to us, and we seem to cheer people up as we go. It is a clear night, and we get our first view of the Somme battlefield.
The war has been raging for 2 years, and Britain wants to decide it here at the Somme. The 50 tanks are to break through, paving the way for the rest of the army to advance into Germany. September the 15th, 1916, 6:10 a.m. The tanks roll out towards the battlefield.
Suddenly a bang against our tank. It's a messenger from headquarters. We have forgotten the food for our carrier pigeons. Dawn brightens, and then I can make out the Germans in their trenches. Mine is the first tank in history to fire upon the enemy.
There is this fear factor of a large metal box that you can't see the men inside coming forward, seemingly unstoppable, and that creates panic in some areas on the German front line.
Germans let fire at us with might and main. My gunners retaliate, killing about 20. And then, we stop shooting. I turn around and see my gunners on the floor. Bullets whistle straight through the tank because the sides are not bulletproof. A smash against my flap and I get splinters in my face and legs. Blood is pouring into my eyes. And then we stop.
At just after 8 a.m., 2 hours into the battle, the first carrier pigeons bring news to the British headquarters.
Stuck with engine trouble just by the road. Send us a mechanic.
Now quite safe, but cannot move. Wanting a new track on one side.
Tank is on fire. The writer has a bullet in his knee, and another man aboard is seriously injured.
Of 50 British tanks, only 10 make it back to their own lines. Among them is Basil Henricus's tank. He and all 7 men in his crew are gravely wounded.
The nervous strain was ghastly. One tank commander went mad and shot his engine to make it go faster. Another shot himself because he thought he had failed. 2 others, including myself, had what I suppose can be called a nervous breakdown. If only we'd been able to reconnoitre. If only there had been proper practice over ground that was like the Somme. What a marvellous story might this Somme battle have been. As it is, the precious secret is out.
British newspapers make the tanks public. And despite the losses, declare a splendid British victory for the tanks. Tanks become a tool of propaganda, even after their very first use. Clever businessmen jump at the opportunity. They produce tank purses, tank teapots, tank cigarette cases, and tank toys for children. At the height of this tank fever, the tank even becomes a star of a London-based ballet.
We like the tank in Britain because it comes at a point where Britain was not doing very well on the Western Front. We seem to have had those huge casualties across the summer. There had also been the situation that Germany was the first to use poison gas. It was the first to use Zeppelins. It was the first to do bombing raids on London. So they seem to have the technological edge over Britain. Suddenly, with the tank appearing, it looked like we'd got some sort of new advantage, something back.
Many British tanks were left behind on the Somme battlefield. They were captured by German soldiers. The German High Command decides to build tanks of its own now. And to do so, they hire Joseph Vollmer, one of Germany's most successful car engineers.
I was to report to the German War Office's Department 7, Transportation. Here they tell me of a secret project named after this department, A7V. I am to lead it and to build Germany's answer to the tanks.
Joseph Vollmer has been building automobiles for Germany's major car companies for almost 20 years. But he is not one of Germany's big industrialists like Krupp, Daimler or Horsch.
The heads of the major car makers, Audi, Opel, Daimler and Benz, they have all suggested me. And so I accept. I briefly outline the resources that such a project will undoubtedly require, and I am promised to receive anything I could need.
Only after accepting does Vollmer find out why he was chosen by Germany's major car makers. They all think it impossible to catch up with Britain's tank programme. Joseph Vollmer is a makeshift compromise. He is told that he will have to build 200 tanks for a start.
The A7V must be faster than the British tanks, better armed and better armoured. For that it needs a crew of 18, just to handle all those cannons. I put the commander and driver on a raised platform to have a better view. Such a large tank will require engines of at least 200 horsepower. But somehow, all my requests are turned down, even though the army promised me the world.
But Vollmer is pragmatic. He scours scrapyards for the parts needed to build a prototype tank. The reason for Vollmer's problems: the British Royal Navy has established a naval blockade against Germany. The country is low on resources, causing industry to suffer. But Vollmer achieves what seems almost impossible. He builds a prototype A7V tank, the first German tank in history, and presents it to the German High Command.
I'm going to Mainz with a queasy feeling in my stomach. It is here that the army will decide whether to accept or reject my design. My A7V has to master a parkour, and does so brilliantly. The general congratulates me and says that it will be built. How many? I ask. 10 is his answer, because there is not enough steel to build any more. That won't be enough to win the war, I tell him, but he only shrugs his shoulders.
In late 1916, England's heavy machine gun corps is still recovering from its losses in the Battle of the Somme. To make up for these, England's arms factories keep churning out new tanks. Since tanks are no longer secret, the Heavy Machine Gun Corps is renamed Tank Corps. The Corps gets its own headquarters and a new Chief of Staff. JFC Fuller has made himself a reputation as one of the British Army's best organisers. On December the 16th, 1916, he arrives at the Tank Corps headquarters.
The chateau is somewhat cold. I find our commanding general standing by a fireplace. He says to me, "This show badly wants pulling together. It's all so new that one hardly knows which way to turn. I want you to do this, to put some discipline, some esprit de corps into the men. Then we shall have a wonderful show."
Fuller sees the appointment as a chance to implement his ideas about modern warfare. But when he visits the tank crews for the first time, he finds an undisciplined mass of men.
Oh, how I abhor disorder and anarchy. And that is exactly what I found here. These men must be properly housed, properly clothed and properly fed. They must be bathed and scrubbed and cleaned up. And not until then can I set to work.
Fuller offers his men what they desire most: a purpose for themselves and their tanks. He soon begins treating the men as well as the tanks as if they were his own children.
The problem now is that nobody outside of the Corps understands tanks and how to use them. I have a plan, but before it is ready, High Command forces me to send them into pointless battles, piecemeal, or over unsuitable ground. I apologize to my men and promise them that their day of glory will come soon. But for now, they have to do their duty.
In the spring of 1917, France's tank commander Estienne is ordered to ready his tanks for their first battle. He was supposed to have 800 tanks at his disposal, but less than half of them have been delivered. Estienne wants to wait until his unit is at full strength, but High Command decides otherwise.
High Command gives us sacred flags. They give us grand speeches. But what they don't give us is a real chance. We were just too few. And what's worse, the Germans knew we were coming. Their artillery destroyed half of my tanks within just one day. Things were so bad that many soldiers refused to continue the attack because they didn't want to die for nothing.
After the failures of the Saint-Chamond and the Schneider tank, Estienne realizes they're just not up for the job. So he goes to Louis Renault, who has actually been working on designs for a small tank. And what Estienne looks for is using smaller tanks in larger numbers.
Renault and I, we understand each other. He knows exactly what I require of my tanks, and even his first drafts are nothing short of brilliant.
The Renault FT is radically different from all other tank designs of its time. It is much smaller. 2 men are enough to operate the tank, a driver and a gunner. Its small size allows the FT to be faster than any other tank. But its most important innovation is taken straight from Borstein's Motorgeschütz. The FT has a rotating gun turret. It can fire in any direction while driving forward.
I present the plans to High Command, and the design is ordered without objections. I'm sure it also helped that Renault, like a good patriot, refused to make a profit on the order.
But Renault is also a businessman. In the spring of 1917, the United States enters the war against Germany. Renault immediately offers them a license to build their own copies of the Renault FT.
When he sells the tanks to a foreign army, he feels emboldened enough to actually make money on this, whereas it was unpatriotic to make any money out of actually designing and licensing the FT-17 tank to his own government, because it was your country in the time of war. The Americans will charge you.
The US government accepts and orders 4,400 FTs to be built. And they mobilize their army. But it will take 6 months until enough of them are in France to make a difference. JFC Fuller, Chief of Staff of England's Tank Corps, plans the next battle without US-American help.
We still have a war to fight, and my battle plan is ready. Cambrai is the place. I am sure of it. It is here that we will slash through the German lines and tear a hole so big that the rest of the army can follow and end this bloody war.
The Tank Corps has grown to almost 500 tanks by now. Fuller has chosen the city of Cambrai for the first large-scale tank battle. The ground here is ideal, firm, dry, and it has not been chewed up by previous battles. The battle is to begin on the morning of November the 20th, 1917. Commanding a section of the tanks is veteran commander Basil Henriques.
I advance through the haze, my tanks at the heel. It seems more like a dream than a modern battle.
The British tanks take the first rows of German trenches and begin to advance further.
And all around us, the Boche are surrendering. We have really done it. We have broken through. Now all we have to do is to wait for the cavalry to come and finish what we've started.
When I heard that my tanks were breaking through at Cambrai on November 20th, I knew that this day would ring in a new age in war. The age of tanks.
The Cambrai attack is tremendously successful. On that first day, it cuts a 3-mile deep hole in the German front line. The tanks go forward. They have tremendous success. The trouble is the communication systems are still not good enough. The cavalry doesn't know about this success till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the victory. And it's a November day. It's getting dark at 4 o'clock. The cavalry aren't there on the battlefield to exploit it.
The British tank crews begin to celebrate their victory when the German counterattack catches them out in the open. Without cavalry support and running low on fuel, the tanks become sitting ducks. 179 are destroyed by German artillery. Many others are captured and pressed into service on the German side. Ultimately, the Battle of Cambrai fails. But the tanks have shown their potential. Just like after the Battle of the Somme, British newspapers proclaim a huge victory for the tanks, a victory that never happened. The British government decides to make use of the tanks' popularity. They set up tank banks in major British cities. These are tanks set up to sell war bonds. The money raised is used to finance more tanks. The scheme is wildly successful. Cities begin competing as to who can raise more money. The Scottish city of Glasgow is the eventual victor. Its citizens donate £16 million for the tanks.
There's a number of elements that come with a tank, one of which in 1918 is, yes, it's a powerful weapon in the sense that it can do damage on the battlefield, but it's also another thing as well. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of the Western's Allies' material advantage. And don't forget as well, Germany was just trying to win that war in 1918 before the Americans appeared in numbers.
In January of 1919, Germany's tank constructor Joseph Vollmer is called into the War Office again.
They are planning one last offensive, one last push to win the war after all. I am even told to double the amount of tanks to be built. Instead of 10, I am to build 20 A7Vs. There is still not enough steel for more. But I have a different idea.
Joseph Vollmer designs an emergency tank. He intends to build it from spare car engines and replacement parts, just like his first A7V prototype. But unlike the huge and unwieldy A7V, this tank is to be small and mobile. The German High Command orders 400, but they only supply Vollmer with enough material to build 5. Instead, the army has dummy tanks built out of wood. These are set up so as to be visible for the Allies. The German attack begins on the 21st of March 1918.
All of a sudden, we are beset with rumours of German tanks. In some sectors, the men even claim to have seen them approaching. Our men in several sectors of the line break and fall back. The British infantry, no more than the Germans, can withstand a tank attack, imagined or real.
The Germans have broken through at Chemin des Dames. They are in our rear and advancing on Paris. There are no more trenches to stop them. I've just taken delivery of the first 21 Renault tanks. It's nowhere near enough, but it will have to do. Now they will have their baptism of fire.
Estienne's Renault tanks meet the German advance in a forest outside of Paris.
The Germans are out in the open and still advancing. My Renaults came upon them like an avalanche. They zigzagged across the field and sent them all to hell. At the end of the day, we'd thrown them back to where they'd started.
By July 1918, the German attack has been shattered and almost all its tanks have been destroyed. The one last push, intended to win the war for Germany, has failed. But the German army is not defeated just yet. It still holds most of Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of France. JFC Fuller plans the next tank battle, intended to break the back of the German defenders. For this, the Tank Corps mobilizes 580 tanks, and this time they have over 50,000 British, French, and US soldiers to follow them, as well as support by airplanes and artillery.
Never again was such a battle as that of August 8th, 1918 to be fought. The technique of tank attacks became perfect. When civilians in the Middle Ages saw armoured knights, they exclaimed, "Iron, iron everywhere." So now, iron fashioned into the tank had crushed our enemy's fighting spirit, had cashiered him from the ranks of the brave. What could a soldier in a woolen jacket do against a soldier girt about with bulletproof steel?
The Allied attack succeeds. In just one day, it forces over 18,000 enemy soldiers to surrender.
And in numerous accounts of later, in 1918, the appearance of a tank has a detrimental effect on German morale. And whereas you may have been stoic enough to sit through the shell fire, stoic enough to machine gun fire coming your way, but as soon as a tank appeared, quite often that was the excuse. It was a time you could actually then say, I can't face this, and that was the excuse to surrender.
On November the 8th, 1918, the German Empire asks for a ceasefire. The First World War has ended. The people of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States celebrate. But elsewhere in the world, a different kind of conflict has emerged. During the war, the United Kingdom was allied with the Russian Empire. The latter has been brought down by a series of revolutions and is now ruled by a communist government.
It is chaos and anarchy on a national scale. Thus do we see emerge, from the green leaves of peace, the red slug of communism. And alas, now the same fate may well befall us.
Fuller's fear is not unsubstantiated. In January of 1919, the people of Glasgow take to the streets. Now that the war is over, they call for higher wages and shorter workdays.
The Secretary of State for Scotland says it is a misnomer to call the situation in Glasgow a strike. It is the seed of a new communist uprising. My tanks are asked to take on a new role, and I have no doubt that we will find them exceedingly useful in this.
fact, after the tanks have been there raising money, they actually send more tanks to Glasgow, but these are in-service tanks in case they're needed to suppress a civil population. And these tanks are actually driven from the station, right, paraded through the town to the what is the local market, which becomes what they call the tankerdrome, the place they kept the tanks. So they're showing off this level of threat that they've got there, and that sense of awe of use of the tank, again, is seen in civil circumstances.
The people of Glasgow yield to the tanks that they themselves have paid for. And so the weapons meant to win the war become tools of oppression. Glasgow marks the first time civilians were confronted with tanks, but it would not be the last.